The history of Island Pond begins on August 30th, 1781, when a group of Rhode Island investors made a random purchase of land in Vermont. The group, led by one Joseph Nightingale, made the purchase through an agent, and it was made official on that date by then-Governor Thomas Chittenden. Thus, the earliest name for the town, Random. The first known settler in Random was Enos Bishop. He settled on the southeast shore of the lake in 1820. 12 years later, the town of Brighton was organized at a home on Carter Mountain. It was at this meeting that the name of Brighton was chosen. The site of that house on the Brighton-Charleston town line has long since been lost. For many years following, the town remained a quiet farming community, with only a few families living along the lakeshore. However, this was all soon to change when the proposed path of a new railroad connecting the western grain fields to the Atlantic Ocean was routed through the town of Brighton. It would seem as if overnight the tiny village of 193 people in 1850 became a boomtown. It was envisioned that Island Pond would become a great railroad junction connecting to both Newport and to St. Johnsbury. But these short lines never came into existence. However, Island Pond did become a railroad center of its own, the midpoint of the Grand Trunk Railroad line between Montreal and Portland. John A. Poor was the main driver behind this entire venture. A man of vision and determination, he pushed investors to create this line in order to make Portland the export harbor for Western wheat and not Boston. In July 1853, the American and Canadian companies finally joined at Island Pond, and many believe that this was the catalyst that thrust the town into becoming such a vibrant community.
At that time, it was a very different town than what it is at the present time. It was definitely a railroad town and a lumber town. At that time, there was no such thing as automobiles or trucks. It was all railroad and teams. In fact, you remember the two bridges that used to cross the railroad yard? Well, originally when the railroad first went through here, they didn't have those bridges, and they had a crossing. And that footbridge wasn't where the last one was. It came out right about where Charlie Johnson's grain store was. And it ended right there abruptly over the south portion of the main line. Anyway, I went into the shop to work, Alan, and I worked, of course, Mr. Marr was the locomotive foreman here at that time. But Ed Maxwell was actually run the place. He was the shop foreman there. And he was a good man, and he'd been with the railroad for many years, and he knew the ins and outs of everything in that shop. Was there when it was built, worked on the locomotives when they were little small locomotives up to the biggest ones we had. It was a very busy place at that time, and I don't know how many men there was at that time. There's a picture of the old 518, which later became the 3428, renumbered at 3428. And those fellows there, I think I know them all. That's Tommy White, the engineer, and that's Jim Campbell. He was later an engineer. And there's Orry Stevens there. And I forget these three in the middle. I guess I can't recognize them, Alan. But that was taken, I guess, right outside the office down here.
With the coming of the railroad came the kind of prosperity dreamed of by communities everywhere in North America at this time. The railroad brought businesses of its own and opened up the lumber industry of the great forests of the Northeast. As Island Pond was the line midpoint, the railroad built a large station and the related shops to support its business. Island Pond was also a night stopover location for rail travelers in the days before the Pullman coach. All the related businesses grew accordingly. Hotels, restaurants, and shops sprung up quickly to help support the new railway passenger traffic. Along with the railroad, the lumbering industry boomed as well. With access to new markets, the once untouched great forests were quickly harvested by eager investors. Mills opened all along the line and in Island Pond as well. The surrounding forests provided a great deal of business for the rapidly growing town. By 1860, a mere 7 years after the arrival of the railroad, the population had soared to nearly 1,000 residents. Not only was Island Pond a bustling railroad town, it was also designated as the port of call for the United States Customs and Immigration. This distinction also brought with it additional growth, business, and staff during this period. The town was quickly becoming an international town of sorts, with a steady flow of persons traveling east and west with little concern about borders. It was easier in many respects to travel to Montreal, Sherbrooke, or Portland than to the neighboring communities of Newport or St. Johnsbury.
I worked from December until May. That's all I worked at the station, but we was very busy. The trains, there was 35 and 40 trains a day coming in here because all the work from Montreal used to go to Portland to the boats instead of going all the way to Halifax. And when Mr. Blanchette had the tailor shop, he had the deer. He had deer. They had a fence put up from one corner of his building to the bridge, and they kept 2 wild deer in there. He paid the state $15 a year to keep those deer. Well, then they got old, and he let them go. He decided he didn't want to bother with them anymore. But they were quite an attraction for young people those days because we didn't very often see deer.
It was during this time of great prosperity and growth that many of the buildings that are recognized by most as the face of Island Pond were built. Hotels, such as the famous Stewart House, the Island Pond House, the Essex House, the Green Mountain House, the Village Hotel, the Hotel Daily, and the Central House were constructed and flourished during this nostalgic era.
What was Island Pond like in those days?
Like, very nice, very quiet. Mostly all horses. Had a horse we had hook on the fire department. My brother used to run the liver stable, Charlie, up on the hill there, where that garage is. Had a big liver stable.
The business blocks that were originally built expanded over the years to include the Bartlett blocks, Bosworth Store, Clark's, Stearns, Hobson's, and many others. The factories in the town provided jobs for many of those not directly employed by the railroad. Some of these operations were the Blueberry Factory, Fitzgerald's Mill, the Shirt Factory, Hawkins Mill, and the Grist Mill.
They opened the store at 5:30 in the morning. And the purpose, my father had the morning shift. And the purpose of that was for the Canadian train, the passenger train that left around 6:10 and went up to Montreal. And I've seen my father come up in the morning for breakfast before we went to school, because Uncle Bill would take over. And he would tell my mother that, well, I think I've made my day's work already, which indicates that they were doing a little bit of business then. Uncle Bill had the late shift. He stayed until after 11 o'clock, and he waited for that passenger train to come in from Montreal, which arrived around 11:05, and then he closed the store. And their old big friend, their old great friend was Amos Parlin, the doctor, who was our neighbor, and also one of their advisors. And I can always remember his grinning and laughing about, why don't you just throw the key away and stay open from 11:30 at night until 5 in the morning.
Time also saw many of the stately houses of Island Pond being built. These homes were anything but simple basic dwellings. It was a direct result of the railroad's accessibility to both the east and the west that the homes and families of Island Pond were always equipped with the latest inventions and the most stylish of fashions.
I worked for 6 years there until I got married. And once upon a time, I can remember that we were about 125 girls there working beside the men folks.
How much did a chair sell for?
Of course, we wouldn't know that. The boss, Mr. Conroy, was the one that'd go to New York and make his shipments, see? So we wouldn't know any of the prices. But we'd get about a price for us for weaving them, about $1.75.
Shortly after the turn of the century, the town of Island Pond experienced another surge of growth. In the years 1903 and 1904, the railroad undertook another age of expansion. The railroad yards were greatly enlarged to meet the needed capacity. 2 bridges were constructed to go over the increasingly busy tracks, and in turn became legendary local landmarks. A new railroad station was built to facilitate the rapidly growing business. The roundhouse, coal chute, ice house, freight shed, and other related railroad buildings grew respectively to serve the booming enterprise. At this point in Vermont's history, the town became one of the larger communities in the state.
And the 20s were good years. The 20s were very good years. And the economy of Island Pond, as I recall it growing up, was very good.
I was in North Stratford. Then I worked for the Grove Paper Company in the woods, blacksmithing. Then I came to Island Pond here. I heard about it a little bit. Then I looked the place over, you know, then a widow Mrs. Pryor used to own the stock inside the shop, you know, a little bit she had. Then she was looking for a blacksmith, and that's where I started. I used to go on the road. A lot of people says, well, we're going to get them shot. Well, you get liberty from Island Pond. You'll go to your farm and show them. And that's where I happened to get bigger, bigger, bigger all the time. I went just as far as the White Mountain shooting horses.
As you might expect, Island Pond, like so many other small towns across America, had a famous native son. Rudy Valley grew up in a home in Island Pond that still stands today. Although he left town at a young age, he returned often during his youth to visit his relatives and is still remembered by some today. His return in 1932 with his full band for a special performance in Island Pond was an event to remember for those who attended.
My father used to run a theater there and a pool room and a dance hall upstairs. Nothing doing. Probation time, everybody was making home brew. So I met the fellow on the corner there. He said, oh, well, why don't you make some home brew? I said, how do you make it? Oh, we should get a couple barrels. And we used to make it all. My mother used to give me hell over in her house. I had 2 barrels. They said I had the best home brew there was. So finally I got caught. I had just regular customers, like Pug St. Pierre and them fellas, certain crew up there drinking beer. Well, they raided me one night. My mother was awful glad I got out of that.
U.S. Senator Porter H. Dale is also remembered as a native son of Island Pond. The son of Lieutenant Governor George Dale, he grew with the town and thrived along with it. He was a lawyer, speaker, judge, businessman, congressman, and finally a U.S. Senator, a seat he kept until his death in the early 1930s. He never forgot Island Pond and returned often to his native home, a home which still remains an Island Pond landmark. Island Pond continued to grow until its population peaked around the time of World War I, with about 2,500 residents.
Mr. John, my husband?
Yes.
Yeah. As a young boy, he went into the Hotel Osborne as a clerk. And he stayed there until he went into the service. And he came out of the service in the 27th of June, and we was married the 15th of July. And we stayed, never moved anywhere out. But here, he went in right into the shop, railroad man, in the shop, not on the road.
What are some of the things you like to do here in town, or who was it you used to visit?
Well, there wasn't never anything to do but the dancing. We did a lot of dancing. Of course, there was a big building on the corner. Do you remember that building? Goulet's owned it. Down below there was a little grocery store, there was a little restaurant, there was a shoemaker, and up at the top was where we danced.
And then when the Great Depression came, there was no welfare then. We had to do the best thing we could. The government gave us a canning kitchen down here, and they furnished all the cans, and that was located in the Methodist Church, in the basement of the Methodist Church. It was 4 of us worked there.
Life was very simple. Everybody was happy. Not a lot of money, but there was some happiness around. Things changed. Things changed. The 50s brought a lot of changes in Island Pond, and the 60s, and the lakeshore, and the values, and the attraction of people coming. And then you had your snow, your winter sports, and your ice fishing, and everything seems to go in cycles.
After the First World War, Island Pond's fortunes started to shift. The town weathered such drastic events as the Great Depression, the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and the diminishing of the once plentiful great forests. With the call to war, Island Pond sent many of its sons and daughters to answer the call to serve in World War II. And in the roundhouse, the steam engine faded gracefully into memory as the railroad, as well as the town, experienced the transformation associated with the entry of the diesel-powered locomotives. Changes continued for Island Pond. While economics and fires may have altered the face of Island Pond, the very special feelings it holds for those who grew up in the town still remain strong. The natural beauty of Island Pond's surroundings make it a truly unique and cherished place. Many have left Island Pond to live and work elsewhere, but the affection felt for this quaint New England village remains with them. Many do come back to visit from time to time, to search for that special feeling of community and nature that can only be found in Island Pond.
You cannot renew your past when you come back to a place like Island Pond. Everything has changed, and your fond memories are not there anymore. But the beauty of Island Pond is something that always attracts you back. There's no question about it.
This production is dedicated to the people of Island Pond, past, present, and future.